And here we go. All right, welcome back. We are INFR3335U in the fall 2021 semester at Ontario Tech University, and it's social and multiplayer game design. We are week 9, part 1 of our broadcast. We're going to be talking this week about designing mobile game quests, but we're going to start off with our guest speaker. So again, we're sitting at week 9. That's November 10th. And again, we have a couple things that we can look at on the horizon. So again, the topic of today is realism versus playability, as well as game balance and designing mobile quests, which we're going to get into that in a second. Just on the horizon. So last week, what we talked about was functional dialogue. We talked about dialogue's purpose in games, as well as dialogue challenges in mobile games. We talked about those things. We also did a very short investigation or case study on Fiasco, the narrative RPG, and I hope you guys had a chance to take a look at that, what I posted up on Canvas. And this week we have a guest speaker, Dr. Alvaro. He's going to come up on board and start his talk on realism versus playability. A bit of game balance is also something we're going to be talking about. 2 types of best practices that we're going to be discussing today around designing mobile game quests and writing mobile game quests. And finally, we're going to just touch really briefly on something called rational game design, which I found awesome and very, very interesting when we, which we'll talk about, and how that can make, we can look at games and how they can be too difficult or too easy. And when it comes to quest design, how does rational game design come into play? So we'll talk about those things. Stuff that's due, just as a reminder, is in-class exercise 4, which I will release after Dr. Alvaro's talk. We'll kind of release that, and it'll be due Friday at midnight. Same format as before. You'll have to write a small blog, just like we did. Project Part 3, which is a group kind of requirement, is going to be due next week. So again, the 3rd playable release. For that release, we're going to be talking about what we're going to be doing there is you're going to build out your first mobile game. And I've been talking to Steven today, your TA, and he said you guys had an interesting experience with him on Monday, where he talked about how to connect to Photon and putting that in. That was one of your in-lab exercises that is also due on Friday from him. So a couple things that are happening kind of all together. All right, so that is where we're at. But without further ado, what I'd like to do is move into Dr. Alvaro's talk on realism versus playability. So Dr. Alvaro, whenever you're ready, if you want to come on board, you can certainly share your screen and everything else you need to do.
Awesome. And hello, everyone. Just want to pull up my video.
I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. Or do you want to do it through the video, or did you want me to do it through like you're sharing your screen? How would you like that?
I can share my screen. I also brought a guest for people to enjoy the company.
All right.
Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, everyone. It's great to be here. So today I'm going to be sharing a little bit of realism versus playability. This is that I have worked with and I'm very passionate about. Something that you guys that you won't get on engines, right? I typically discuss these things with my grad students or in summer courses where the subject allows to. But for today, so we're going to be looking at some aspects for you to consider because sometimes there is a misconception about realism, and you're going to see a lot of people being driven by offering the most realistic experiences, and that doesn't necessarily correlate to a good playability. So the purpose of this lecture is just to show some concepts and open your minds on things that you may want to consider for your games. Particularly if you're doing things on mobile, on web, or if you have any interest in VR, this is something that is going to cover all those areas. For example, this morning I was in a meeting with some other colleges and universities that are part of a funding from Ontario. And one of the teams is working on developing a full VR experience using A-Frame. So for those of you who are not familiar with A-Frame, A-Frame is an open source. It's for developing VR experiences. It goes very much on the line of like they wanted to make it so inclusive that they went for an HTML style, right? It has a lot of challenges. So the team they were reporting on these things, but it was very interesting to see them trying to push what they were able to do with their limited resources. And again, something that is out there and something that can deliver great experiences, but not necessarily photorealistic or hyper-realistic experiences. So the first thing that I wanted to show, and I know Zoom does it better than Google Meet. I don't know if you have seen this clip, but basically in this clip from The Simpsons, the family is going to the carnival and they're fighting to where they want to go, right? So Bart wants to go to the yard simulator. And what's interesting about this episode is that earlier in the episode, he's being asked to do the yard, right? To do and mow and clean, and he doesn't want to because it's boring. But when the guy sees the opportunity to do it as in a game environment, you can see that the kids line up, and that is not so different from real life. There are a lot of simulation and game experiences that allow us to escape, yeah, to engage in a different reality of sorts, right? And that comes with certain considerations. And one of those is fidelity. So when you see the word fidelity, it's associated with realism. So the higher the fidelity, the higher the realism. However, the higher the fidelity is not the same as immersion, presence, or cognitive motor skills development. So it's going to depend on the use case. You can have very low fidelity experiences that have high immersion and presence, right? However, there are some technical components that are going to make this different. For example, if you have if you look at all the old TVs, or if you look at old displays, or if you look at early graphics cards, you're going to see that they have lower resolutions, and that can be troublesome if you are asking your users to read stuff, right? So I don't know how many of you have seen old games running on new TVs. They're going to see that there are a lot of issues with how things are upscaled, and sometimes they don't work very well. The other thing with lower resolutions is that those can lead to distractions. And ultimately, if your user gets distracted, probably they won't be completing the task, right? And in games, that is troublesome because if the user can't complete the game because of a technology problem, then your game won't be successful. The other thing is movement. Again, look at all tech, and people have to come up, developers have to come up with different solutions to compensate for the lack of resources in the machines. Ultimately, if you're getting into VR, again, lower resolutions may be affecting how people perceive depth, which is going to be an issue for VR and MR. Finally, embodiment. Lower resolutions, depending on how they're presented to the user, can affect embodiment. While this is particularly important for immersive tech, this can also affect presence depending on how the game flows. Okay? Now, if I ask you these questions, do you need higher realism to achieve dynamic, alive, and immersive games? It could go either way, right? And that's why I have these two pictures here, because, for example, when I started playing games, it was around 1984, and the first game that I was playing was Pac-Man on the Atari. and the graphics were very different from what they're now. But I can tell you that I was very engaged, and I was in flow, I was immersed, and at the time those were the greatest graphics. And if you look at things like more recent games, and just for example, Red Dead Redemption 2, you're going to see that the level of realism has gone to a place where you can start debating if it's actually good enough for the game and the user experience at the end. So if you look at the evolution of graphics, you're going to see that things have changed over the years. And again, just technical limitations made people be very creative on how they could convey different cues. So for example, at some point they were playing with perspective just to convey that sense of depth, or moving planes, right? And as things progressed, realism became more important. So for example, here in this animated GIF from Flight Simulator, you're going to see different stages from the evolution, and you're going to see that things got better over the years, right? So in this particular case, you can argue that higher realism is going to be good, particularly because if you look at any sort of simulator, you would like trainees to get trained in an environment that is as much as close as the real thing, right? Because how many of you would feel comfortable if you know that, for example, a surgeon has been training with a game controller, right? So how proficient is going to be that person when using a medical instrument if they haven't had any experience with it, right? So depending on the use case, Jace, you're going to strive for additional realism. But you can see from Flight Simulator, and this is something that happened in Flight Simulation, is that at the beginning they had just lines. That was it. And they were using lines, and people were training with those lines. But they had a lot of hardware that was providing all the additional inputs. So it wasn't only the visuals. So I don't know if you have ever seen a commercial Flight Simulator. Basically, it's a replica of the cockpit on top of a robotics mechanism that is going to allow for all the movements and the 6 degrees of freedom. And the visuals, again, at the time, they were just simple graphics. At some point, they were using pre-recorded videos, right? So they would have a camera crew go in the plane and record everything, and then they created loops for the trainees to visualize these kind of things. If you continue looking at the evolution of graphics, you're going to see that things got better over time. For example, polygons, 3D models, cell shader, physics, and different rendering techniques, and the evolution of the GPUs got us to a point where we're getting like very accurate clothing, skin, grass, shadows, and it's becoming this battle of showing off what your game can do in terms of visuals. And I don't know how many of you have played games where yes, the visuals were outstanding, but the game wasn't impactful. And again, that's another thing that we can discuss many games. So where are we in 2021? So if you look at Unreal 5, this is rendered with Unreal. And I bet you that if you show this picture to someone who is not familiar with engines or rendering or CG stuff, people are going to think that this is real. So if you take this screenshot and show it to someone who is not in this medium, chances are they're going to think it's real. So we're getting to that point where we can render things that are very realistic. Now the thing is, okay, so how for example, is my player going to interact with this environment? What sort of boundaries am I going to insert into this scenario, right? And that is going to affect playability, because if you have something like this, you're going to create an expectation on how the user is going to be able to interact with this. So in my case, if a game throws me in this environment, I'm expecting that I can climb and I can go anywhere I want. But if you really think about it, how many games pull that off, right? Not that many games. So again, expectations. Yes, you can have something very realistic, but to what extent you can play with it. Now, another thing that I wanted to show you is that when you look at what people are doing with Unreal, so it's very interesting how news are using Unreal to create this mixed reality representation that can be used for weather or for other things. I find it very interesting because there was one with the flooding. So they were saying, okay, so if it rains this much, we're going to get this much water, and this is going to look like this in your neighborhood, something like you see here, right? And I think that is very powerful because if you show pictures or if you show any other type of media, I don't think it's going to be that impactful, right? So this is an interesting use case where you can combine the technology just to let viewers better understand what could happen, right? So another thing that I wanted to show, and you won't find this one on the slides because I just saw this today. But NVIDIA has been developing their Omniverse tool, and one of the things that they're doing now is virtual avatars. And this lady here is completely fake. It's being generated by an AI. And what's interesting about this is that, for example, they're doing this in real time, and they can provide different languages, and the AI is going to tweak the lip sync. So, for example, in this case, you can have the avatar speaking in English, German, Spanish, French, Mandarin, and this can happen all at the same time, right? Now, again, if you show this to someone who is not familiar with these kind of technologies, again, people are going to think that it's real. But once the avatar start moving and turning the head, then you start seeing like something's off. But if you show this with a nice background and good lighting, chances are that you can be deceived by the technology. Okay. So, for example, in the future, you could have a virtual Tom or a virtual me giving you a lecture. So, while typically realism is associated with graphical detail and realism and photorealistic environments are getting a lot of momentum, this is completely different from realistic playability. Again, as I was saying before, there is an expectation, right? When we play games, we make some assumptions on how things are going to be working based on our experience with the real world. And while realism can be extended to a game's rule set, there are some compromises, right? Because then you need to think, okay, so what is more important, being realistic or have an experience that is fun, entertaining for the users? Because realism can break a game. And just to provide some examples, I don't know how many of you have been in a similar situation. I used to love playing Formula One games, and I stopped playing because they became too realistic. So it came to the point where I had to spend a lot of time in the pit, just customizing everything in the vehicle, just to go outside, have someone else just push me over the off the road, and then I would have to go over the pits to recalibrate everything, right? Or if I had an accident, my car was not performing as I wanted to, so there wasn't any point on continuing the race, right? So by increasing the level of realism, now for some users that's okay, but for me as a regular user, it was just too much, right? So basically, the game expected me to learn a lot of things that I wasn't invested, so I dropped. Okay. Um, and another example. So Assassin's Creed Odyssey. One of the things that I love about the game were the visuals, the realism of the environment. But if I take out that of the equation, it was a very boring game. It was very repetitive. the story wasn't compelling, at least to me. I'm not going to spoil anything. There was little wonder, right? I enjoyed the visual because I have visited Greece, and I think they did a great job replicating some of the locations. And basically, that was my main drive for this game. I just wanted to see a location. I wanted to see Athens. I wanted to see Crete. I want to see these depictions of places where I have been, right? And for that game, the only thing that I was hype about was the Atlantis, but I was required to buy it separately, right? So again, in this case, realism didn't match the expectation of the game, and even like the combat and the movement, it doesn't match, right? So there was a break between the realism and the playability. And just to go back, the locations amazingly. And if you have seen how they did it, they use a lot of photogrammetry and a lot of details. And so I would spend more time just looking at the details on some of the structures than actually trying to complete the mission, right? And because they forced me to do grinding, I hated the game even further. I finished it just because I wanted to see Atlantis to find out that it was a DLC. And here comes a controversial one. I know that a lot of you may be fond of Control, but that was a boring game for me as well. I know that people praise the gameplay, but one thing that break the game for me was that when I was expecting to take actions every time that the character was interacting with others, and it got into this like thinking mode and analyzing the situation. I was like, oh, I would like to make the decisions, and unfortunately, the developers decided against that, so I couldn't make any decisions. I was forced into a path that if I had a choice, I would have done things completely different, right? So in this case, yeah, the game has great visuals, although some of the NPCs they look way lower quality than the main character. So they put a lot of effort on the main character, not the others. But then again, when they strip away from me the agency, they 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 kill the game for me, right? Because in real life, if I'm being put into those situations, I want to be in charge, right? And many games they do this. Even for example, I remember when I was playing Metal Gear 5, right? So every time that I got into a mission and I wanted to make a decision, or I was being forced into something, so I had my path already defined. So I didn't enjoy that because that's not how real life works. So that is something for you to keep in mind, that balance between agency and the playability of the game, right? Uh, Another one that I was looking into is Red Dead Redemption 2. So what is interesting about this game is that the developers were going into so much detail about what you could do as the character that it ended up affecting the game experience for some players. Because, for example, if you were crafting stuff, you were forced to go through all like the skinning animal process, and you can skip it. If you're looting items, you have to do this individually. Again, they wanted to make it so realistic that ended up hindering the game for some, right? And as the gaming, it's obsessed with giving you things to do. This may become repetitive, boring, right? So then again, this is a case where they went to the opposite extreme and they give you this realistic experience that again is going to affect flow, right? If you look also at The Last of Us, they kind of did something similar. So in this case, they have the NPCs being a bit more humane about their interactions. So, for example, you would hear them cry out names when someone gets killed. Uh, but uh, but again, it just becomes in the way of the gameplay, right? So if you go to great lengths, you need to have a good strategy on how this is going to be cohesive so that the player doesn't feel that this level of realism is getting in the way of enjoying the game. So at this point, we can discuss on how realism can negatively impact playability. And we have I have presented some examples. For sure, you can find many more. But to avoid this, I was saying consistency is key. You need to find out that balance and define things in a manner that won't get in the way of the player enjoying the experience, right? And just to highlight another example where consistency it's a huge issue still in many games. So, for example, in Mafia 3, you could drive the car, you could drive on the on pavement, you could run over a pedestrian, but if you get caught by the police, like you're going to only get a speeding ticket, right? So there is an inconsistency there on what you can do and the consequences, right? I remember when I played LA Noir, I was really curious about how Rockstar was going to handle the driving. Because if any of you have played Grand Theft Auto, you know that you can do crazy stuff with the vehicles. But in a late noir, you can never run over a pedestrian. So that was interesting. It looks weird. Um, and then again, it's somewhat unrealistic, right? Because the way it's being handled. If you look, for example, at Tomb Raider, the character would get filthy and when doing something, but in other occasions, that wasn't the case. Sometimes, for example, I don't know if you have seen this. For example, I was recently playing Resident Evil 4 in VR. Great game, by the way, great 4. But they still have some of those old game things where, for example, if you shoot certain items, you won't get the direction you're expecting, right? For example, like some glass can be broken by shooting at them, some more glass don't. For example, some doors you can just blast them with a grenade. Some others, even with a broken launcher, don't even get a scratch, right? So again, consistency is key so that you keep the users within the flow of the game. So going back to these two pictures, one thing to consider is that graphics are always going to get outdated, but the fun component is not going to, right? And that's something that is going to help you also look at your games in a different manner because sometimes again, if you're striving for realism, what is realistic today may not be in a year or two because the technology will continue evolving, right? So no matter how real, you will always face difficulties with coming up with one-to-one realistic representations. And why is this? We have a huge variability of users. And why is that important? Because all of us perceive things differently. Even if you compare healthy players with players with numerous conditions, you're going to find this variation. And just a quick example, colorblind game players, they're going to have an entirely different experience than those who are not colorblind. Okay? The other component is the high variability of hardware. So back in the 70s, in the 80s, there weren't many consoles or computers that would play games. But now we have a huge variety of everything. So we have handhelds, we have different mobile devices, we have VR, MR, XR, different types of computers, Mac, Linux. So you need to be more thoughtful about the resources that you're employing for running your game. Because depending on who your target audience is, they may or may not be able to play the game, right? And also, that same hardware may affect how your game is played. And just an example, I don't know how many of you own a Nintendo Switch and how many of you have bought ports of games that run very well on the PS4 or Xbox or on PC. I happen to buy some of these games mainly because I wanted to support the developers, and I wanted to support these ports. But my last adventure doing that was Mortal Kombat 11. Horrible port, lots of issues, right? So in some cases, it's very difficult, and depending again on the studio behind it, some of them do a great job, right? The other component that is very tough is the replicability of reality. As I was saying before, there is an expectation when you're playing games or how things are going to work. And that's why, for example, having tutorials and having the players learn the mechanics, understand the game is going to help manage those expectations. Because otherwise, you're going to be into something expecting something else. Okay? So why realism fails is because on top of the things that I just previously said, we have factors associated with how we perceive the environments, and that speaks to immersion. How we feel connected to that environment, that speaks about presence. How we see ourselves in that embodiment, right? So we have also pervasiveness, flow, engagement, engrossment, cognitive absorption, and accessibility as other components that are going to change how we perceive and enjoy this realism. And just to give you an example, when I was little and I used to play Mario Bros, it was on a CRT. It was with a gamepad connected to the console, and I had high levels of immersion. Even there is a case that is discussed in one VR book about a child who was playing Nintendo, and they were so into the game that they didn't even realize that the apartment they were in was on fire, right? So that also speaks to cognitive absorption. When we are in flow, when we are within the game, we can completely forget and lose track of time. We can get fully distracted and absorbed by the experience. And that is because we're being immersed, we are having high presence, we feel embodiment, and we're engaging with all of these things. Okay? So when we refer to immersion, that is the user's engagement with the system through their senses. And typically, if we're doing a computer monitor, it's going to be most of the time just auditory and visual. But if you're doing something like VR, then you're going to get haptics and you're going to get more immersive because your senses are going to be further stimulated. When we discuss things like presence, we're referring to how we feel as part of that virtual world, right? So that goes back to those of you who were in Engine's last lecture. I was discussing about human interface devices, and one of the things that and I saw firsthand when playing Mario Bros with family and friends is that people got so into the game that when they wanted Mario to jump, they would pull up the controller. There wasn't any connection between moving the controller and Mario jumping because Mario was responding to the press of a button. But nevertheless, people felt so connected with the character that they ended up performing physical movements. And that led us to how these two are perceived. So when we talk about immersion, we're talking about our sensory feedback. So that is visual, auditory, and haptics. But when we discuss presence, it's more about how we interpret these things, and that pertains to the cognitive side of things, right? Um, in terms of embodiment, that is that sense that the virtual body that you're seeing, you experience as an extension of yourself. So, for example, I remember when I used to play Call of Duty or any other first-person shooting, I used to feel like I was the character, and for me, it got to the point that I got so into the game that I was the one holding the gun. I was the one exploring. And I remember once I was playing Half-Life 2, and I was so into the game, and my sister came into the room. And as she came into the room, I have one of these things jumping towards my face, and she touched my shoulder, and I scared. I just threw away the keyboard, and just because my first reaction was feeling like the thing actually jumped into my face, I throw myself on the floor, right? So uh, feeling immersion, presence, or embodiment can be done through the screen. Sometimes people think that, oh no, this only applies to VR experiences. That's not true. That's not how it works. Okay. So when we talk about pervasiveness, is that extension of the physical environment into the virtual environment. While this is a bit tricky with like personal computer or console experiences, uh, you get a little bit of that with those custom made user interfaces. So, for example, the Nintendo Zapper, the Super Scope, the Donkey Kong bongos, the dancing pad for Dance Dance Revolution, or any other add-on like the guitars or the strums or the keys for Guitar Hero and Rock Band. So all of those peripherals, what they're trying to do is extend that physical world to the player. And again, that just has immersion, presence, and embodiment. So the example that I'm showing here is something that is currently happening in gaining more momentum in VR, is that you can replicate your environment and just augment it using virtual representations, things. So that brings us to flow, right? So on top of all the concepts that I just covered, they're going to change and they're going to affect how the user perceives flow, right? So when you are engaging with this, you're going to have that the person is going to be focused on that task. They're going to have a high sense of control. They're going to be very aware of what's happening, but they can also lose self-awareness with respect to the real environment. And they can experience a distortion of time, which happens when you're in this state. So what is important here is to highlight that again, you want to stay away from the boredom and anxiety areas because they're going to affect the experience. And I'm not going to talk much about it because I know that all of you are familiar with this chart. I just want to make the connection between this and the other concepts that I'm discussing. The other things I said before is consistency. So make sure that you have concrete goals and manageable rules because those things are going to affect the cognitive load. There is so much that our brain can process, and if you have that discrepancy between again what the user is expecting to happen, what is happening, and how the user can make it happen, you're just adding complexity to what the user needs to do. And by adding complexity, you're increasing cognitive load that is decreasing performance, immersion, presence, and it's just a bad experience, right? And for example, in the GIFs that I'm showing here, when you have users um, and not understanding the relation between what they're doing. That's where you can see people completely get immersed in forgetting about the environment, which can result in some accidents. So it's very important to understand your user and identify, okay, where is the place that I want to put my users so that they can perform the tasks, right? So you don't want them to have difficulties when performing this task because again, you can affect perseverance. So you can have players that are going to drop, right? So you have something that is stressful, again, performance going to go down. In terms of engagement, that is that emotional and cognitive and behavioral connection that exists at any point within the experience. And that's something that we want to achieve with games. We want our players to connect with the game. And sometimes realism can be a barrier, right? because there is an expectation on how things work, right? In terms of engrossment, that is the degree to which the experience can hold the user's attention. So why am I showing these two particular gifts is because if you present something that is going to negatively impact the user, you won't be holding their attention. And this is something that is happening, for example, with virtual reality. You can actually have someone developing a post-traumatic stress disorder when exposed to VR. So for example, someone who gets who gets a huge scare in VR, it's very unlikely that that person is going to try it again, right? And I've seen it. I've seen some people, for example, there are some games where you can look at a plank up high in on a building, and it's the feeling of being there in the depth and seeing everything small. It's very powerful. I've seen people who have tried that and they don't want to ever try VR again because it just felt too real, right? So think about how you're laying out your experience and how you can hold the user's attention. As again, just going back to one of my examples. For me, Formula One did when they add all that realism. Okay. In terms of cognitive absorption, this is very important because it's what is going to allow us to engage with temporal dissociation, which is when we lose track of time, focus and measure, high enjoyment, control, and curiosity. So all of these are associated with perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. So if your cognitive absorption is right, it basically means that your player is going to be having fun because they're experiencing all of these things. So when you're designing for presence, again, be consistent, right? Because we're basically developing illusions. So we need to manage how this illusion is plausible for the user, right? So sometimes as part of your design process, you would like to look at how you could measure presence. And that ties more on like human studies and game user research area, but that's very important, right? And for example, in this video that I have here, when I played Attack on Titan 2, one thing that sparked my interest in thinking, how cool would this game be if I could play it as a third person? Because this is not playable, it's just a cutscene. It was very interesting because I don't know how many of you have watched Shingeki no Kyojin, but seeing this made me wonder that this could be a very interesting game mechanic and something that would add realism to that experience that I've seen in the anime, right? So one good example of how developers manage these expectations is, for example, Breath of the Wild. And if you think about the game, photorealistic rendering, nah. Realistic actions, nah. I mean, if you have done any cooking in Breath of the Wild, you know what I mean. But if you look at the agency, they nailed it, right? So when Nintendo were bragging about this game and they're saying you can go anywhere, I was really happy that I was actually able to do it, and I ended up going to some locations where I just got killed several times because I was underprepared for it. But that was a great balance, right? So it wasn't that realistic, but the level of agency compensated the lack of realism to the point that it was very enjoyable, right? And that again comes to the point that realism doesn't necessarily equate to playability. So how much realism? You may be wondering at this point. So come up with a plan, right? So this is something that I suggest my grad students to look into is what is the experience design plan? So what is the goal of the experience? What is the goal of the user? What are the metrics? Who is the audience? What is the narrative? What are the emotional interactions? What is the social experience? How deep is the presence? right? Because when you look at all of these things, you can start thinking, okay, so where and when does it make sense for have something that is realistic, right? So it may not be the entire game. You could come up with something that is very, very, very centered. An example, I don't know how many of you played early Mortal Kombat games, but as you were progressing throughout the tournament, there was a point where you could break a piece of wood or what was it, stone and other things, right? So you basically have to smash the buttons and get to a certain level so you can crack that piece of wood in half, right? So Mortal Kombat is not realistic at all, right? But that portion was okay and it was very self-contained, okay? So the right amount of realism depends on many factors. So some factors are going to be associated to us, the users. So you're going to see human factors. And it is a good idea for you to understand how we perceive, how we process that information, and how we act upon that information, right? And another thing to remember is that games are abstractions of the real world, and they are limited by the technology and the user, right? So, for example, if you think about a user with a disability, they're going to have a different approach to performing a task, okay? So when we look at information processing, we're going to have a perception that is driven by auditory, visual, and haptic cues. We're going to take that information, we're going to encode it, transfer it, and we're going to take action, and that is going to lead us to pay attention, to engage with decision making, and use that feedback, which is basically this diagram that I have here. We have the stimuli, we have our senses, we perceive, we process that information, we decide what we want to do with it, and then we perform an action. So then we have perception, cognition, and physical ergonomics. So what is happening is that the events are sensed. Then again, we take action and we use typically our fingers because we use gamepads. Then we get feedback. Feedback can be visual, can be auditory, can be haptics if your controller is crumbling. And through those interactions, we're going to be tinkering with the attention. So we're going to help users navigate the experience by providing the feedback, right? So sometimes feedback can be in the form of highlighted areas within the scene, just to indicate where they have to go next, or quick time events when you get to show them information that they need to act upon. So that brings us to perceptual realism. So in this case, when we refer to the visual component, we want to think and ask ourselves, what do these visuals convey about my game, right? So if you're wondering about how much visual realism you want, just think about how that it fits within the context of your game. Think about how the game is going to be perceived and how you're going to manage that expectation of what the game is going to deliver versus reality, right? If you look at the auditory component, then same thing, you're going to think about, okay, so what does the audio convey about my game? How's it going to be perceived? It's going to alter the expectation. Because, for example, now we're getting very used to a spatial audio. So if you're playing a game in stereo mode, how realistic that is going to feel, right? And I don't know how many you own an Apple devices, but they're doing a lot in this area. I noticed recently Windows update saying like, hey, you can now listen audio in spatial format. I haven't tried, but those are things that are becoming more ingrained in technology and something that is worth considering because of that expectation. And the same applies to the tactile environment. So when you look at visual fidelity, again, it's something that it's up to discussion. So all of these avatars are avatars that are using virtual guiding tools. And you can see how from squares to more realistic avatars, they may change, right? So, for example, when you look at this slide, I want you to think, okay, which of these avatars I would feel more comfortable speaking to, right? Because the level of realism, depending on the task, is also going to change how the user engages with the action. So one thing that I can tell you with virtual avatars is that sometimes when you go into higher realism, you can get into what is referred to as the uncanny valley. And it is this representation that is realistic, but there is something odd about it that makes it creepy. So for example, if we look the avatar on the far right, that is the most realistic one. But you can still see that even though the tracking is very good, there are some odd things. And the problem with those odd things is that they can get you distracted. And by being distracted, you may not be doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? So avatars that I found work really well are, for example, the anime one, and even the second one, like these two in the middle, they're just creepy, right? And the other one next to the anime one to the right, it just looks creepy too, right? Because the thing is that when you have seen the person and you see this avatar that lacks some features, it's just weird. And again, when I use these avatars, the creepiest ones, people just keep asking things about them, right? And again, it just deviates completely the focus of the meeting that I'm in, which again, it's interesting. So in terms of cognitive realism, things that we want to look as how the stimuli is perceived and processed. So basically, there are some things that are going to affect how your user perceive the environment, and that is existing knowledge, right? And that's why the expectations are so important. Because, for example, if you know that if you have an apple and you drop an apple, you know how a falling apple looks and feels. If you do the same again and you don't get the same feeling, there's something off about it, right? The other thing is representation, and that is because again we are associating the real world with whatever is being depicted in the game, right? Uh, the other thing is that based on how we process the information and act upon it, we're going to be storing actions that we perform into a short-term and long-term memory, right? And that is going to be important depending on how you want your users and players to develop skills throughout the game. So this brings us to attention. And it is very important for you to maintain the players focused on the activities that matter, right? And if one of the focus is having them roam through the environment, make sure that there are certain mechanics that are going to trigger that exploration. So, for example, when I played a Horizon Zero Dawn, I was so compelled on how the animals and the artificial life was behaving that sometimes I would just stay. I wouldn't do any mission. I'd just sit there and just watch things unfold. And if you have read about how these guys pulled that up, they put together a really good AI solution for those animals. And for those of you who have played the game, I don't know if you have seen it. For those of you who haven't played the game, so again, it was not a game that I was drawn to explore, mainly just to see what was unfolding. Now, things to be careful with attention is that attention is selective. So if you're showing way too many things, you're going to be dividing the attention, and that is going to affect the immersion process environment. So what how are they going to make their decisions, and how that ties into the emotion, right? Because making decisions that are going to be meaningful is very important. So it's something that is going to make them happy, angry, worried, sad. It creates that connectedness with the environment. And again, you don't need realism for this. You can crop it out in many different ways. And as you go throughout this journey of behavior and skills, you're going to get to the point that because the players have been engaging with the task and practicing, they're going to make decisions faster. So it's going to improve their performance and, and skills within the game. So when you look at the skill acquisition, you're going to have a cognitive stage, an associative stage, an autonomous stage, and then you get the skills stored permanently in long-term memory. And again, you have to think about how you're going to engage the user to practice all of these tasks throughout the gameplay so that they get further connected with the game. So one example, when I started playing Resident Evil 4 recently, I was having a lot of difficulties getting used to the controllers. I was playing in immersive mode, but the longer I played the game, all my movements became more natural, and I was way better at switching and loading guns and using my knife and all the things that I had at my disposal, right? So you want to create that meaningfulness within the experience. Ultimately, when you have developed the skills, then you can start looking at decision making and how you're going to be engaging the user with high level process, deeper thinking so that they can become more aware about what's going on, right? Because that is going to ultimately enhance their speed and accuracy to respond to the game challenges. And that's why you see many games scaffolding. So you're progressing, you get a mini boss, then you progress a bit further, things get more difficult, and so on and so forth. So once we have done all this journey from the human factors, and okay, we have all of these, the other components, how we're going to be performing the tasks. And while typically we're going to be using our hands in a gamepad, that doesn't mean that we can use other peripherals. So for example, in this video, this is from a Japanese game, and what it does is it has an add-on, and it's somewhat like a Pokemon game but with fish, and you use the add-on to reel the fish, right? Uh, so you can argue that this sort of device is going to take advantage of the user ergonomics because you can hold the system and you can perform a task similar to fishing because you're reeling in. So in this case, ergonomics play an important factor because you need to think, okay, so how is my user going to use this peripheral in a manner that is not going to get in the way of the experience, that actually is going to complement it, right? And for those of you who engines, I'm going to show it for those of you who are not in engines. I was showing this, oh, sorry, I'm going to change my camera so you can see my camera properly. So I have this add-on, and this is for the quest. So for example, in this case, this add-on, I can swap my controllers, and this this peripheral makes a huge difference when I'm doing first shooting games in VR because the representation of what I'm doing in the real world matches what I'm doing in VR and enhances my performance, right? And that associated with the ergonomics, right? And how I'm using that controller. In some more cases, you can look at body-based interactions. So, for example, in this video, this is for a VR experience for Dragon Ball. So in this case, they're using hand tracking, and I don't know if you have seen Japanese commercials, but they're very particular. So in this case, okay. So in this case, they also have the markers on their hands, and they can practice a virtual reality Kamehameha. Okay? So then again, just to make a connection between this and game consoles, when you look back at the Nintendo Wii, at the Microsoft Kinect, at the PS Move, your body can become the source of these interactions. And that's something that is very prominent in VR games. Okay? Now, you can also extend this to the controllers, and I find this a bit weird, but Nintendo developed a game where you can milk a cow, and because the haptic feedback on the Joy-Cons is so good, they just wanted to showcase that use case where you can feel that you're squeezing, right? I haven't played this, uh, uh, mainly because I can't justify paying, when this game was launched, it was expensive. I mean, for what I was getting, I didn't feel like it, but if I see it being very cheap, I will try it. So that brings us to the accessibility piece, and it's ultimately like something that you would like to consider, mainly because depending on who your end user is, you're going to find that there may be barriers to using your game. Right? So ultimately, in an ideal world, we would like no barriers so that anyone can use the game, right? So that is a huge strength and something that I would like to think about. So with everything that I've said up to this point, there are some takeaways uh, from the presentation. Is that realism is not a one-size-fits-all. Right? It heavily depends on the use case, and that's associated with your end user. Knowing, understanding your users is going to help you fine-tune the perceptual, cognitive, and ergonomic factors. So you can say, oh, this is the right level of realism because this is what we want with our game, right? Note that realism does not guarantee a fun experience, right? Too much realism can break a game, and that's mainly associated because of those misrepresentations and the expectations on how the real world works, right? Now, while you can tweak the realism by looking at the graphics, game design, and user input levels, always look at your user and the use case to determine where you can make this happen and how significant and meaningful it is to your game. And that's it. I don't know if you have any questions. I can take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alvaro. And I'm looking forward to hearing some questions from the students. I know they had put some in the chat. So we have some questions there already, or some comments actually. But anyone else have any questions or comments around realism versus playability, which was the talk that Dr. Alvaro just gave? While they're waiting, I know for me, whenever we play any kind of tabletop game, right? So we've been talking to the students this semester about Dungeons and Dragons, and maybe you haven't had a chance to play that, but one of the things we do is when we create a mechanic in a game, and one of the tasks that the students have had this semester is make their own little game system. And the warning that I always have is, what if, as an example, you try to make the rules or the mechanics too realistic, right? So it kind of goes in line with what you said. So what are your thoughts in terms of if you were going to make your own game system, right? Whether it's a desktop game, so not a video game, or whether it's a video game, mobile or otherwise, what is your goal when it comes to the level of realism? I know you kind of mentioned a bunch of different factors, but if you were going to make a game for yourself, thinking about your favorite games, what would be that level that you want to achieve? What would you say?
So, perhaps a bit of a step back from what I want. And what I would do is, and this I would suggest to everyone, is I would rather come up with a prototype, and I would do like a design thinking session or a focus group, looking at my target audience, just to complement my design with their expectations of realism. And the reason why I say this is because sometimes as developers, we ended up developing the game we want and not the game that people are going to play. And those are very two different things. And I've seen many developer diaries for games where you can see like, oh, we wanted to develop this game and the game flopped, the studio closed, that was it, right? So yeah, so it's not so much about what I would like to see, but it's more about the process. So what I would do is follow up somewhat this recipe that I showed today about understanding your use and the human factors, and conducting some prototyping sessions involving the users, right? Because for example, everyone has a different taste for games, and while I have not played Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't do much tabletop games. My experience is very novice in that area. What I've seen is that there are significant entry barriers for those of us who are not familiar with those games, right? So, for example, if you ask me about it, I would rather have easier ways to get engaged with that type of game, particularly because I find them very demanding with all the imagination, creativity, and discussions that are surrounding how the game evolves. And that is not something that is very easy for outsiders like to get an idea of. So, for example, if you want to develop a Dungeons and Dragons game for people who are not into Dungeons and Dragons, it's going to be very different from those who are into it. So that's why doing designing, prototyping can help you better understand what is that you need to implement or include or consider to ensure that the game is going to respond to what the users are expecting. And again, it's just to avoid developers' bias, right? So that's why I prefer to take a step back and do some designing prior to just go along with what I want. Because again, what I want is not the same as everyone. And I don't know if there were any comments when I was speaking about control, but I know a lot of people love control. For example, James is one of those. And when I told James like I didn't dream, I was like, why? How?
Yeah. Sometimes realism. Here's another question I have for you. Sometimes realism is something that attracts players, right? So it's kind of an attraction or a novelty, right? So and some companies, what they do is they sell that aspect. Like we just saw, you mentioned things like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, how one of the draws was it's really realistic that you're going to be there and stuff. And you mentioned how you spend more time looking at the environment than actually playing the game, right? So when does realism, as a novelty, when does that wear off? How fast does that wear off for you when you're playing a game?
So for me, it wears off when it gets in the way of enjoying the game, right? So for example, Assassin's Creed, once I unlocked all the cities, because that was my goal, I just wanted to level up enough so I could go exploring. I didn't care about the story, I didn't care about the characters. And once I did that, I just finished the game because I have a rule of my own. If I buy it, I finish it, even if I don't like it, right? But yeah, once I did that, it was like I'm done with this game. I don't care what's going to happen with these characters. Same thing happened when I was playing another game that it became so tedious that I was just skipping all the dialogue. Like get over with this, right? What was it? Oh, The Witcher 3.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
those visuals were amazing. Like seeing the werewolves and seeing all the animals and the specters. Uh, it was amazing, but it was so long that I couldn't handle it.
Thank you for that. What about when it comes when realism for AI? So we have AI, and sometimes AI breaks the immersion for us, right? Where we have, where it's ultra realistic. You talked about consistency, and then the world is beautiful, but then the AI, it's not beautiful. What are your thoughts around AI and realism?
Yeah, so I think that for AI, you need to be very very conscious about its limitations, because if you understand the limitations of the technology, you can self-contain it, right? And that's, for example, going back to Horizon Zero Dawn, they were very clever, right? Because the animals, they have a limited line of sight, so they are going to only to respond with things that are within, let's say, the scope, either visual or auditory. If you make noises, they're going to hear you. But that applies to NPCs too. If you're looking at like human-like NPCs, just know the limitations of the AI so you can self-contain it. Because otherwise, as you point out, they're going to break the game. And one other thing, if you're looking into like speech to text or text to speech or animations from AI, those are getting a lot of attention. They're getting better, but then again, they can be uncanny. Uh, so sometimes you can work around those things by using lighting, camera's perspective, just trying to kind of hide it, uh, because yes, they can be distractful and they can get in the way of the experience. And and ultimately, you want people to focus on that connection, emotion with the game, and not on its flaws.
Okay, last question for me. I know you've done a great job talking to us about realism versus playability. So this is my last question. Maybe if anyone else has a question as well. You discussed creating an avatar that was more realistic, and you mentioned how sometimes it gets really weird to make an avatar that's super realistic. Although part of our game, a lot of times we make a game, we play a game like there's a mini game to make a character. We actually were talking about that before we started. New World has this ugly, kind of avatar creation, if you will. But when does it get uncanny? When you talked about weird, you're really kind of talking about the uncanny valley where, we're looking at an avatar and it's so realistic, but yet not just perfect because it's not matching our expectations of reality. Maybe the lighting is weird or something, and it's just wrong. What do you think about realism and the uncanny valley? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So my thoughts on that is that it has to be avoided as much as you can, because again, it's just going to distract players, and that that is something very tricky, because the way our hair moves, the way our skin reflects light, the way our lips, our teeth, our tongue, our sweat, all of those things are very difficult to replicate still. So when you see a virtual avatar that doesn't have those things properly work, it just looks weird. And you start focusing on those things because it's just natural. It looks different, and you want to figure out why it's different, and or the movement, the muscle movement, the lips, the gesticulation, the way the eyes, the eyebrows, the wrinkles, everything works is so complex that what I found works best, at least for my virtual meetings, is using lower fidelity output. People don't make any fuss about it. They're entirely happy with cubes and not so detailed avatars. And the same apply to games. For example, as I was saying, in Control, where you look at the main character, the lady looks amazing. But when you look at the other characters, like, ooh, what happened with the budget?
Yeah. It's very true. It's very true. Well, Professor Alvaro, thank you so much for this talk. I think that, oh, here we go. Jin has a question or a comment. Well, I don't think realism is a problem of tabletop role-playing games, because in tabletop role-playing, all player know the dice gods exist. When God says yes, it just happens. Okay, Jin. But you know what? I think with tabletop role-playing games, and again, Professor Alvaro was talking about video games, but to me, when you want to make a realistic system, something that, for example, a body hit location system on a tabletop role-playing game, you want to be ultra realistic, because in real life, when you swing a weapon, you can hit a body. We did that when we talked about, on our last speaker, talked about how we made a system like that for Conan, the role-playing game. But the challenge with it is it's so realistic sometimes, it bogs us down. It kind of takes extra time for for us to play the game. Each turn in a turn-based game takes a lot longer, because you have to deal with all these realistic things to upkeep, right? And that's the challenge, right, for that question. But anyways, back to what you were saying, Dr. Alvaro. Thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate the fact that you came out tonight and took time to talk to us about realism versus playability. Well, I've given the class a little in-class exercise that is due on Friday based on your talk. So thank you so much.
And I hope everyone enjoyed this. It was a bit different from what we're doing for those who are thinking my instrument is a little bit different. So yeah, I hope that everyone enjoyed. And just to add something to that tabletop realism is that one thing that I've seen, and one thing that I wouldn't mind using, is mixed and augmented reality. Because when I remember when I tried doing tabletop RPG, one of the biggest things was like getting into the role, like imagining things, and that is easier for some people than others. But if I have something like AR or MR that helps me visualize and contextualize what's happening, I think that I would be more willing to dig into it. And there have been some games that try to do this, where you can point a camera to the tabletop and you can get some augmentations. There are some good examples out there. Let me just. This one. Yeah, I'm going to put it on the chat for everyone to see. Just an idea on what sort of thing I'm referring to.
Thank you for that. And there's also Desktop Simulator, right, which is something else that's out there that you can do in VR as well. All right, thank you so much. And again, we're going to move on now to the next part. But Dr. Alvaro, thank you so much for tonight, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Yeah, take care, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.
All right, guys. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to go back to some of the stuff we're doing. But I'm going to turn off the recording on YouTube for now. We're going to take a short break, and I'm going to redo the video for the next part, so you can have a separation between the video that we've done with Dr. Alvaro and then the video that we're going to do now for the second half. Okay, so let's do that now. I'm going to stop recording on YouTube, and then we'll regenerate that stream.